Okay, what do we have next? Oh, was Richard III a usurper? I would say no. Lots of other people would say yes. The story has long been that they were put to death in the Tower of London, probably on the orders of their uncle Richard, when it became clear that they were still a threat to him. Why was Benedict Cumberbatch at Richard III's funeral? It's a really good question. Hello, I'm Matt Lewis, the host of History Hits Gone Medieval podcast, the Echoes of History podcast, and documentaries about medieval history. I'm here today to answer your Google questions about King Richard III, something lots of you may well know I'm very, very interested in. So, full disclaimer, cards on the table, I am what I would call a Ricardian. I believe that Richard III deserves a more positive reputation than history has normally given him. I've previously been chair of the Richard III Society. Richard III has been my main area of study for more years than I'd care to remember now. So I have my opinion about Richard III. I'm sure you probably have yours too, but I'm going to try and give you the facts, the evidence, give you as much information as I possibly can so that you can make up your own mind about Richard III. Okay, let battle commence. First question. When was Richard III born? I can do this, it's an easy one. His birthday was the 2nd of October 1452, and he's born at Fotheringhay in Northampton. And one of the ways that we know his birthday for certain is that Richard wrote it into his own Book of Hours, so his own religious book that he used to carry around with him everywhere. We actually went and saw that book for a documentary that we did on the Voice for Richard project, which you can watch now on History Hit. And you can see a handwritten entry on the 2nd of October that says this was when Richard III was born at Fotheringhay Castle in 1452. Right, next question. Was Richard III York or Lancaster? So Richard III is a member of the House of York. So we often think of the Wars of the Roses being about the House of Lancaster, which was the kings Henry IV, Henry V and Henry VI, fighting against the House of York, led initially by Richard, 3rd Duke of York, who is Richard III's father. Edward IV will become the first Yorkist king of England. He's Richard's oldest brother. And then Richard will become king after the events of 1483 that we may or may not get into later, who knows. Was Richard III a Plantagenet? He definitely was. So he is descended from King Edward III, a member of the Plantagenet royal family. There are lots of debates around the Wars of the Roses in terms of who has the best claim to the throne, but essentially they are all members of the Plantagenet family. Was Richard III a Tudor? He really wasn't a Tudor. Richard III's grandmother was Joan Beaufort, and Henry VII's mother was Lady Margaret Beaufort. So they do share Beaufort descent, but they are not related in any way through a Tudor line. Was Richard III disabled? So we know from the discovery of Richard's human remains in 2012 under a car park in Leicester that his skeleton showed signs of scoliosis. So for a long time, Richard had been portrayed, particularly by Shakespeare, as having a forward curvature of his spine, what's cruelly termed by Shakespeare as a bunchback or a hunchback, that he had a withered arm and that he walked with a limp. And this gives him that really malevolent presence on stage. What his skeleton demonstrated was that he didn't have a limp of any kind. He didn't have a withered arm, and he didn't have kyphosis, that forward curvature of the spine. What he had was scoliosis, which is a sideways curvature of the spine. And the effect that that has on a person that is visible tends to be if they lean forward, you will notice their shoulder blades protruding quite a lot. And when they stand up straight, it may result in slightly uneven shoulders. So one shoulder may appear to be higher than the other. Dominic Smee, who has the same degree of scoliosis, explains that he has normal lung capacity. It doesn't have any effect at all on him. And what we can say about Richard is that he fights in battle. He's not restricted to the point where he can't get on a horse, he can't wear armour, and he can't fight. It may well be that Shakespeare's representation of Richard originates from the fact that when Richard is killed at Bosworth in 1485, sources describe his body being stripped and thrown over the back of a horse to be taken back to Leicester. So at this point, his spine would have been on display to everybody. And as he's hunched over the horse It may well have caused his shoulder blades to protrude. So it's based maybe on a kernel of truth, a story that may have come out about the shape of Richard's spine after he died, but it is hugely exaggerated and turned into something else for dramatic purposes by Shakespeare, which makes it all the more of a shame that that's the image of Richard that stuck for centuries afterwards. Did Richard III have any siblings? He has lots and lots of siblings. His parents, Richard, Duke of York, Cecily Neville, the Duchess of York, have a total of 12 children altogether. 7 of those will survive infancy. So the oldest is a girl named Anne. Then comes Edward, who will become King Edward IV. Then is Edmund, who is Earl of Rutland, and he dies at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460 alongside their father, the Duke of York, at the age of 17. Then comes Elizabeth, who will become Duchess of Suffolk. After that, we have Margaret. As Dowager Duchess of Burgundy, she's incredibly important to the protection of Burgundy's independence. After Margaret, there is George, who for a while will become Edward IV's heir. George is a really complex figure who rebels against his oldest brother Edward on several occasions. He will end up being tried for treason in 1477 by Edward, and he's executed in early 1478, reportedly by being drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. The execution was undertaken in private, so we don't know that that definitely happened, but that's a story that springs up fairly soon afterwards. So George is a tricky figure because he betrays Edward a lot, but he's actually quite close to what will be the youngest of the York siblings, Richard, the man who will become Richard III. After that, the last surviving child will be Richard. There is a daughter named Ursula who is born after Richard, but she doesn't survive infancy. So I always think it's one of the things that plays against Richard, Duke of York in the Wars of the Roses, that Henry VI takes a long time to have a son. For a long, long time, there is no heir of his body. When he does, he only ever has one son. And in comparison to that, you have the man considered his heir while he's childless, York, having so many children he barely knows what to do with them. He provides a stark contrast to Henry VI. Was Edward IV a legitimate king? There have been questions about whether Edward was actually an illegitimate child. There is a suggestion that Cecily Neville had an affair. I really struggle with this. The story of Edward's illegitimacy comes from France, so particularly from King Louis XI of France, who, for him, this was a favourite after-dinner joke. You can definitely view him as a usurper in terms of the way that he came to the throne, albeit you can also make a counter-argument that there is an Act of Parliament that describes the mechanism by which he does take the throne legitimately. And ultimately, once he's undergone a coronation, for all intents and purposes, he is then a legitimate king. How did Richard III take the throne? His brother Edward IV dies completely unexpectedly in April 1483 at the age of 40. And there is then a series of really confused events as the new King Edward V is proclaimed and moves from his position at Ludlow on the Welsh borders towards London. Richard begins to move down from the north to London because he's been put in charge of the government by his brother. And then over the weeks that follow, all of that will begin to fall apart. There is this bigamy story that emerges, and then Richard is effectively asked to take the throne. So interestingly, he takes it in an almost exact recreation of the way that his brother Edward IV took the throne. So in terms of the mechanism by which it happens in 1483, Richard is visited by a delegation of the representatives of the City of London, some of the nobility, the mayor, the important figures of London, key members of the church. They visit Richard at Baynard's Castle and they present him with a petition asking him to become King of England as the next rightful king. I guess the subtext of the question is whether Richard III was right to take the throne or not. And that's a really complex issue that depends entirely on your subjective opinion of what Richard is doing in 1483. In legal terms, there is evidence presented that Edward IV had married bigamously. That made his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, his queen, bigamous. So Edward V, who had been proclaimed king and who people had expected to succeed for the last 12 years since he was born, is considered illegitimate, and that's an absolute bar to the throne. He can no longer become king. Edward, Earl of Warwick, might have been considered next in line to the throne, but when George is tried for treason, his entire bloodline is explicitly removed from the line of succession, so his son can't legally become king. So Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as the youngest son of the Duke of York, is offered the throne of England. And the big unanswerable questions around this is what's really going on. Where does the bigamy story come from? Does Richard make it up as an excuse to take the throne? Does someone else make it up because they don't want a 12-year-old minority crisis? They don't want a child king on the throne and sell it to Richard? Or is it simply true that Edward underwent this bigamous marriage ceremony? Okay, what do we have next? Oh, was Richard III a usurper? I would say no. Lots of other people would say yes. I think you can probably comfortably argue either side of that. So in favour of being a usurper, well, he deposes Edward V, who most people had expected to be the next rightful king. Whether he usurps the throne depends almost entirely on whether you think the bigamy story is true or not. If you think the bigamy story is a lie and a pretense, and that he steals the throne from his nephew, then you could definitely describe him as a usurper. Against that, I would argue that there is a legal process at work here, that Edward V is excluded from the line of succession and legally barred from becoming king. And there is space then before Richard is offered the throne, the space of a day. So when Richard III is offered the throne, there is no incumbent. There is no current king for him to take the throne from. Again, you could argue that that's because Richard has manufactured the situation in which there is no king to be removed. You can see how this thing all gets tied up in knots backwards and forwards. I think it's interesting that Richard III is so often singled out for being a usurper. When you think about the history of kings coming to the throne from the conquest in particular, William the Conqueror is a usurper. He steals the throne by military conquest. We can think about Edward III as being a usurper when he takes the throne from his father. Henry IV is definitely a usurper by taking the throne in battle. He is a usurper too. It's odd, I think, that Richard is so often singled out as a usurper when everyone around him was. He wasn't even the most definite usurper in his own century. When did Richard III become king? So he legally becomes king on the 26th of June, and that is cemented by his coronation and the act of anointing on the 6th of July shortly afterwards. I guess all the controversy is really around the why rather than the when. Okay, next question. Oh wow, the biggie. What happened to the princes in the tower? Right, reset the clock, we'll be here for another couple of hours. The bottom line answer, stripping away everything else, is that we don't know. They're remembered as the princes in the tower, so this is Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, the two sons of Edward IV, the nephews of Richard III. They're remembered as the princes in the Tower because the Tower of London is the last place that they are seen or recorded as being seen during 1483, playing in the grounds of the Tower. They were shooting with bows and arrows on one of the lawns in the Tower of London. And the reason that they were there, again, the Tower of London has this kind of sinister reputation that emerges in the Tudor period as this dangerous prison that people go to await execution, never to be seen again. In 1483, Edward V goes there because it's the place that monarchs prepare for their coronation. So when he is preparing for his coronation as King Edward V, he's installed at the Tower of London. There is nothing unusual in that. His brother comes out of sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, where his mother has taken him to join his brother at the Tower of London to prepare for that coronation. It's believed that there would be lots of outcry if the king's brother wasn't in attendance at his coronation. And so Elizabeth Woodville, their mother, allows him to go to the Tower of London. Of course, we know that Edward V will not make it to his coronation. It's at this point that you can begin to wonder whether there are darker reasons for them to be kept in the Tower of London, why Richard had put them both together in the same place and got them both secure before the bigamy story emerges. Again, it all comes back to what you think about Richard and what he's up to during these weeks and months. The story has long been that they were put to death in the Tower of London, probably on the orders of their uncle Richard, when it became clear that they were still a threat to him and that people may use them to try to depose Richard. I don't buy the argument that is often made that the princes were no threat to Richard because they were illegitimate. That illegitimacy could be removed as easily and as quickly as it had been put in place, and in fact it was in 1485. The reason that I don't think Richard was a threat to his nephews was simply that he's 30 years old when he becomes king. We know a lot about Richard and the things that he has done and the type of person that he is, the things that he's interested in. And nowhere in that 30 years do I see any evidence of a man whose first response to a constitutional crisis would be to murder two small children. And not just any children, the sons of the brother who he had served loyally all of his life, the man who had been responsible for all of his security, everything that he had in the world. It would be a pretty scant repayment for all of that. I don't think that Richard would have approached that situation thinking murder was the only and the first option. I think he would have wanted to try something else. My suspicion is that he would have separated the princes. They've been brought up apart, so there's no kind of trauma for them in sending them to different places. Perhaps he sent Edward, the oldest and the most dangerous, to the north of England, to the castles that had been loyal to Richard. I think it's possible that the youngest, Richard, Duke of York, was sent to the continent, perhaps to Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, Richard's sister, to whom he was very close. Could he have been raised there? There are bones that have been found inside the Tower of London and interred in an urn in Westminster Abbey that claim to be those of the princes in the tower. They were discovered in 1674 while some building work was being undertaken underneath the footings of some stone steps. Thomas More tells us that the boys were murdered and buried at the foot of some steps, which seems to fit with those remains. The political context in which those remains are found is interesting. Charles II, who is king at the time, is in dispute with Parliament, and I think he is trying to make a political point about the deposition of kings, the murder of kings. He would have considered his own father to have been murdered by Oliver Cromwell with the execution of Charles I. So I think there are lots of context in which those bones are found. Lots of other bones have been found in the Tower of London over the years too. They're quite often claimed to be those of the princes in the tower. So ultimately, we don't know. The options are that they are murdered in 1483. They may have been murdered on the orders of their uncle, Richard III. They may have been murdered by somebody else who either thought that they were doing Richard a favour in getting rid of his potential rivals, or was trying to undermine Richard's rule by having him blamed for the murder of these two small children. Or they could have survived their uncle's reign. Either they escaped an effort to have them killed, or Richard never meant them any harm and had protected them, and that they then have to deal with the fact that Henry VII, Henry Tudor, is on the throne of England, and maybe they come back as pretenders to threaten Henry's throne. Maybe they don't. There's an awful lot of ifs and buts and different scenarios available in there, but I'll come back to what I said at the beginning. At the moment, we simply don't know with 100% certainty what happened to the princes in the tower. What did Richard III sound like? It's a really interesting question, and you can find the answer right now on History Hit in a documentary called The Voice for Richard, which followed a decade-long project to try to recreate a voice from history. And Richard III happened to be a really good candidate for that project because of his human remains being found, access to some documentation that was quite close to his voice. You can watch the full reproduction on YouTube, and you can watch the History Hit documentary to find out all of the behind-the-scenes info about how that brought together so many disciplines around language and science and technology as well as history. And the bottom line seems to be that Richard had a lot of Yorkshire in his accent, bit of E up in there.
The clarity and charity of the sun's lift is so great that when it is poured on the other heavenly bodies, the sun shines with no less lift and splendour.
Okay, what have we got next? Did Richard III ever get married? He did. He married Anne Neville, who was actually his first cousin once removed. So she is the youngest daughter of another Richard, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the man that history remembers as the Kingmaker. They get married around 1471, maybe 1472. We don't have a record of the date or the place of their marriage. It's quite possible it was at Westminster Abbey. So Warwick is killed at the Battle of Barnet in 1471. Richard is given lots of his northern lands, and part of the reason for marrying Anne Neville is to smooth his transition into power in the north. We also do know that Richard and Anne had known each other as children. So Richard is brought up for several years in the household of the Earl of Warwick, and so would have encountered Anne probably on a regular basis. We know for certain that they sit at the same table at the investiture feast of Anne's uncle, George Neville, as Archbishop of Canterbury. So the seating plan for that event survives, as does the menu. Warwick spends an absolute fortune on the event. It seems incredibly likely that they knew each other, possibly knew each other fairly well. There is a huge danger with starting to think about whether they loved each other. Love in a medieval marriage is almost impossible to spot in these circumstances. I think what we can say about them is that they work together as a medieval power couple incredibly well. They are married for the rest of Anne's life. She will die in early 1485. So they're married for 13, 14 years. But prior to Richard becoming king, they are very successful and very powerful in the north of England. So that to me suggests a couple who, even if they don't love each other, are working together incredibly well towards the same aim. And our next question is, how did Richard III reform the legal system? Thank you very much to whoever's typing this question to Google, because it's a really interesting aspect of Richard's reign that doesn't get talked about very often. Richard has one parliament in January and February 1484. That does all sorts of standard things that Parliament does. It's often been claimed that Richard invents bail. He doesn't invent bail. That's been around for a couple of hundred years by this point at least. But what he does is reform bail. So there are lots of circumstances, contrary to Magna Carta from 1215, in which bail is being denied to people wrongfully. Richard tries to correct that system so that if people are denied bail, justices can go in and see them given access to bail, and that also people are punished for denying bail. He also ensures that when you're arrested on charges of a crime, your goods can't be seized until you're found guilty. He's not protecting the elites, he's assisting those further down the legal scale. So he will also reform jury composition, and he will say that you have to be worth a certain amount of money in order to sit on a jury. And that might sound odd to us today when anybody is entitled to serve on a jury. But the problem that they had in the 15th century was corruption. People were buying jury decisions, or they were loading juries with their own people, or they were threatening people who were on juries to get the decisions that they wanted. And Richard is trying to strip away all of these layers of corruption to ensure that those who can't fend for themselves are getting proper access to the due process of the law. He will also introduce in 1484 the Court of Requests, which allowed people who couldn't afford to pay a lawyer access to courts and the legal systems. So Richard's effect on the legal system, I think, is important. These policies are very much in line with things that we see Richard doing while he's Duke of Gloucester in the north of England. So I think you can attribute these actions to Richard. But I know that you can argue again that this may just be the machinery of government at work and not really anything to do with Richard's policies and Richard's interests. Did Richard III have any children? So Richard had one legitimate child from his marriage to Anne Neville. His name was Edward of Midland, probably named for Richard's older brother, because there only seems to be about 3 names in the Wars of the Roses for boys. He was probably born around 1476, though that date isn't very well recorded. It's sometimes put a couple of years earlier. There are suggestions it might even have been a couple of years later. When Richard becomes king in 1483, Edward is invested as Prince of Wales, but he will sadly pass away within months of achieving that office at the age of roughly 8. We have no record of Richard having any mistresses during his marriage to Anne Neville. That doesn't mean he didn't, just means we don't have any record of it. But we know that he did have 2 children who seem to have been born before his marriage to Anne Neville. He has a son named John, who's known as John of Gloucester, son of the Duke of Gloucester. John, when he becomes king, will be made captain of Calais and treated with a great deal of respect. He has a daughter named Catherine, who will be married to the Earl of Pembroke when Richard becomes king. Illegitimate children weren't able to inherit in the same way as legitimate children, so there is a differentiation between them. But Richard does acknowledge those 2 illegitimate children. What we can say for definite is he has 1 legitimate son as a result of his marriage to Anne Neville, and 2 illegitimate children who he acknowledges and looks after, but we don't know who their mother or mothers were. Why did Richard III lose the Battle of Bosworth? I don't want to talk about it. Henry Tudor will invade England in August 1485. He will land in southwest Wales, march up the West Welsh coast, cut inland to Shrewsbury and pick up what is now the A5, the old Roman road of Watling Street, heading for London. Richard has been mustering his forces at Nottingham, which is in the centre of the kingdom. He doesn't know where the threat is going to come from, so he's based himself at Nottingham because that allows him to reach all corners of the kingdom most easily. When he hears that Henry Tudor has landed, he's reportedly excited. This is his chance to defeat the last threat that he perceives to his crown. So he marches his forces from Leicester, gathers his armies at Leicester, marches them out and intercepts Henry Tudor around Market Bosworth. He leaves Leicester before he's got his full complement of forces because he knows he needs to intercept Henry and he can't wait any longer. And that's probably a good move by Henry. He forces Richard's hand. The numbers at Bosworth are quite interesting. So quite often Richard is portrayed as having a big advantage of numbers, perhaps twice as many men as Henry Tudor. But when things are worked out, it's not quite the same. So Richard possibly has 5,000 or 6,000 men. Henry Tudor has maybe 5,000 or 6,000 men. Backing Richard up is the Earl of Northumberland, who has another few thousand men, but who never manages to engage in the battle for whatever reason, and we'll come to that later. So you can probably take his numbers out. There's also Thomas Stanley, who isn't at the battle himself. He sends his little brother William Stanley to the fighting instead, but he never engages for Richard either. And in fact, he will end up engaging for Henry Tudor. So I think there is a way to play these numbers that actually makes it look fairly even on the surface at least. So the Duke of Norfolk will lead Richard's vanguard against the Earl of Oxford in Henry Tudor's vanguard. Norfolk is very quickly killed. He loses that vanguard fight to the Earl of Oxford. And at this point, Richard leads a charge of his household cavalry. It's often said that he spots Henry Tudor making his way across the battlefield to talk to the Stanleys, doubtless to encourage them to enter the fight on his side, and that Richard wants to prevent that happening. It's also possible, it's been argued, particularly by Richard Mackinder, that the charge was Richard's battle plan all along, that the engagement of the vanguards was meant to move Oxford out of the way so that Richard could lead a charge against Henry Tudor. And there would definitely be chivalric knightly appeal in leading this thunderous cavalry charge of your household knights across the battlefield towards your inexperienced, you may well have thought, poorly protected enemy. But Henry is surrounded by French mercenaries who fall into what is known as a hedgehog formation. So they use their long pole weapons to present a spiky front against those charging horses that disrupt the cavalry. The knights around Richard fall. We're told that he's the last, he's brought off his horse, and that he dies fighting surrounded by his enemies. His skeletal remains that were discovered in 2012 will show numerous serious wounds. It's unclear precisely which one would have caused his death, but it's probably a bladed weapon like a halberd or something has come down on the back of his skull, sliced away part of his skull, and would have exposed his brain. That would certainly have left him unconscious if that wasn't the blow that killed him. So why does Richard lose the Battle of Bosworth? Bosworth is interesting because it's more like a battle of three armies, because nobody knows what the Stanleys are going to do, and they play this pivotal role. They come in at the last moment when Richard has charged Henry. William Stanley will lead his forces in to back up Henry. There's been suggestion that William Stanley meant to go and fight for Richard and gets caught on the wrong side of the fighting, but all of that is really unclear and muddies the water greatly. The Stanley intervention is pivotal in ensuring that Richard loses the Battle of Bosworth. So having that kind of third element on the battlefield, it's not just two armies facing off against each other, it's this one off to the side that nobody's quite sure what they're going to do. Richard's rear guard under the Earl of Northumberland is unable to reinforce Richard's army when things began to go badly. It's not clear whether Northumberland is trapped by some marshy land, whether he is trying to keep an eye on what the Stanleys are doing and feels he has to protect the rear and the flank of Richard's army, or whether Northumberland simply betrayed Richard and decided not to fight. Again, his motives are really unclear during this period. But that means that at key moments, Richard is deprived of support that he needed, and a third army enters the fray for his foe, for Henry Tudor, and ultimately leads to Richard being killed. And next up we have, how did Richard III die? He died in battle at Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485. He's the last king of England to die on a battlefield. Not the last British king, because James V of Scotland will die on a battlefield too. Over the century or so that follows, we will stop seeing kings being at the front of charges of their army, and we'll begin to see the birth of this more tent-based generals at the back of the battlefield, and monarchs not actually going on campaign with their armies as the centuries proceed. But even Shakespeare portrays Richard being brave. Someone offers him a horse thinking that he wants to flee the battlefield.
A horse! My kingdom for a horse!
And Richard says, no, I need another horse to get back into the fight.
I have set my life upon a cast, and I will stand the hazard of the die. 5 have I slain today instead of him.
I need a horse to get back in there and find the real Henry and kill him. So even Shakespeare, for all of his monstrous portrayals of Richard, doesn't accuse him of cowardice at the end of his life. So I think we have to concede that Richard dies bravely as a warrior on the battlefield. And the next question is, how old was Richard when he died? This is a really interesting question because so many portrayals of Richard make him old. Laurence Olivier looks like an old man. Ian McKellen plays the version of Richard III that's set in Second World War Germany as an older man. Richard was 32 when he died at the Battle of Bosworth. He's 30 when he becomes king. He's still an incredibly young man. With a lot of medieval lives, it's incredible to think what people achieve at such young ages. Richard has packed so much into his adult life and yet only makes it to 32. And our next question, why did Lord Stanley betray Richard III? Thomas Lord Stanley is an interesting figure. So he is a baron in the northwest of England around Lancashire. His family have been getting increasingly powerful over the generations, and he controls vast areas of the Duchy of Lancaster, is a wealthy and powerful man who could put a large army into the field if he ever wanted to. He's someone that Edward IV has courted and kept close and made good use of. So Stanley is Henry Tudor's stepfather. So if we're wondering about why Stanley might prefer Henry Tudor on the throne, there is a definite benefit to him in his stepson being the King of England instead of this man who he has much less of a connection to. But we can also trace a feud between Thomas Stanley and Richard back to 1470. And this all centres around Hornby Castle. So Hornby Castle belonged to a family that were allied from the beginning of the Wars of the Roses to the House of York. Thomas Stanley tries to take that property from them. When law and order begins to break down in 1470, as Edward is about to be driven out of England, Thomas Stanley has a cannon brought up from Bristol to Hornby with the intention of blasting this family out of Hornby Castle. And the reason that he never fires a shot and the reason that he doesn't get his hands on Hornby Castle is that Richard, as the 17-year-old Duke of Gloucester, places himself inside Hornby Castle. We know this because he writes a letter and signs it at Hornby during this period. And I suspect that that beginning of a feud at Hornby in 1470 is at the front of Thomas Stanley's mind in 1485 when he's taking to the battlefield at Bosworth, and he's weighing that up alongside having his stepson on the throne as a reason to oppose Richard and see him killed at Bosworth. And our next question is, how long was Richard III's reign? 2 years and almost 2 months. Striking, I think, that he still gets so much attention. And our next question, how was Richard III's body lost? Well, Richard was taken back to Leicester, slung over that horse at the end of the Battle of Bosworth. His body is put on display in the centre of Leicester because Henry Tudor, who is now Henry VII, needs everybody to know for certain that Richard is dead. So that involves displaying his body so that people can see it, know that he's dead, and know that he's not coming back to threaten Henry Tudor. As Henry is preparing to leave London, we're then told that some of the monks from the local Greyfriars Church petition Henry to be allowed to bury the body. And Henry kind of gives them a bit short shrift, but says, go and get on with it, hurry up. So Richard is buried in what we now know to be a shallow grave that was too short for his body too. So that suggests that there was a rush to get him buried and into the ground. The Greyfriars Church in Leicester was dissolved when Henry VII's son, Henry VIII, broke with Rome and instigated the dissolution of the monasteries. The church was stripped of anything of value and left to crumble. The property was sold off. Eventually houses were built around it. gardens were laid out. We know that one of the mayors of Leicester would own that house and garden, and that he would erect a monument in the garden saying, here is the spot where once upon a time King Richard III's body was. Over time, the city centre of Leicester is further developed. That point is all but lost. We have always known where in Leicester the Greyfriars precinct was, but precisely where in that precinct the church was, and precisely where that would mean that Richard III's body was buried, became sort of lost in the mists of time. Next up, who became king after Richard III? Well, Richard III's death ends 331 years of Plantagenet reign, stretching back to Henry II in the 12th century, and gives us a new dynasty on the throne. Henry Tudor, who had been Earl of Richmond and had been in exile for 14 years, for half of his life, he's 28 when he becomes king, becomes King Henry VII. So he becomes the first Tudor king of England, establishing a brand new dynasty. His son will become Henry VIII. His grandson will be Edward VI. His granddaughters will be Mary I and Elizabeth I. And the Tudor dynasty will then be followed by the Stuarts, who have a Scottish connection to one of Henry VII's daughters. He is an ancestor of every monarch that has ruled England since he did. Where was Richard III found? He was found precisely where he was buried. So despite stories that his body had been dug up and thrown away, chucked in the river, disposed of in disgust at the reputation that he languished in for centuries after his death, he was still in that shallow, short grave that the monks had dug for him at the Greyfriars Church. The archaeological dig, when it took place, came across walls that had been cut across. So Richard's toes don't remain with the body because a wall had been cut across where his toes would have been. So we can see on several occasions how close the body came to being completely destroyed or lost totally or dismembered and disrupted in the grave. And yet it lay there for more than 500 years until it was uncovered in 2012 under what was then a social services car park, which had been built in what used to be the Greyfriars Church precinct. Next up, was Richard III reburied? After his remains were discovered in 2012, he was reinterred a few years later at Leicester Cathedral, which is just over the road from where he was found, from where the old Greyfriars Church was. He has a new tomb that you can go and visit. He is interred in there in a wooden coffin that was made by one of his collateral descendants, Michael Ibsen, the man who provided the DNA sample that linked back to Richard III and established the identity of those remains. He's a carpenter from Canada, so he made the wooden coffin that Richard's remains were put in inside that tomb. So you can go and visit Richard III in his splendid surroundings at Leicester Cathedral today, if you want to. Next up, why was Benedict Cumberbatch at Richard III's funeral? It's a really good question. So Benedict Cumberbatch gave a reading at the reinterment service for Richard III. And my understanding is that this came about because they found out that Benedict Cumberbatch was another collateral descendant of Richard III. So he's descended from a sibling of Richard III. I think he's something like Richard's 16th cousin once removed. So across the generations, he has this familial DNA connection to Richard III. Next up, does Richard III have an unfair reputation? Depends what reputation you think he has. I tend to think Richard should enjoy a more positive reputation than he has, that he did some really interesting things that we could think about being progressive and good, that there is a scenario in which he was never a threat to his nephews, the princes in the Tower. But you can also paint a scenario in which, confronted by problems in 1483, he navigates those by positioning himself to take the throne, which leads him to have to eliminate his nephews as potential threats to his own position then. So do I think the traditional reputation of Richard as a bad guy is unfair? Yes, I absolutely do. Lots of people will think that that's an untenable, ridiculous stance for me to take, and that Richard is everything that history has portrayed him to be. And that's absolutely fine. This is part, for me, of the beauty of the study of Richard III. You can bring whatever you have to this, and we can debate it, and we can discuss it, and we can reach our own conclusions if we want to. But we can do that respectfully. We can do that as friends. We can do that based on the evidence that we're able to put in front of each other Richard is just a great vessel for historical study, I think. Was Richard III a good king? I'm going to have to fall back on my my now traditional response of it depends entirely what you think about Richard III. I would say that you can make a case that Richard was a good king in the sense that he championed those who couldn't look after themselves, that he favoured those lower down the social scale, that he envisaged a fairer England. But I would also say that he was naive in the way that he tried to implement that. In the widest assessment, what is a good medieval king? It's a king who rules, preferably for a long time, who dies in his bed with the crown on his head and hands it safely and securely to his son. By all of those metrics, Richard fails. By the measures that really matter, even I would concede that Richard III didn't make a good medieval king. Thank you very much for watching this Google question session on Richard III. I could probably have kept going for another couple of hours, but I'm sure you've got things you need to be doing. You can subscribe to History Hit at www.historyhit.com/subscribe to get access to hundreds of documentaries and ad-free podcasts, many of which that I'm involved in will be about Richard III. So it's a great place if you want to know a bit more about this topic. Subscribe to History Hit's YouTube channel too to get access to more of the best content in history.